Steve Blank joins us today from his hidden retreat on the coast of California. He's an adjunct professor at Stanford and co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. Steve is one of the key architects of the lean startup movement and helped develop programs like the NSF Innovation Core and Hacking for Defense. He's also the author of the 4 Steps to the Epiphany and the Startup Owner's Manual. Steve, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Going to be fun.
It's been a while. It's been probably 5 years, and it's been a while since the early days of the lean startup movement. So let's just get right into it. Do those principles still hold up in the sort of AI native tech environment we find ourselves in?
Normally I would give you an engineering answer, which is a one bit, yes or no, but I'm going to give you a business school answer, and that says it depends. And the answer is it depends because I think it's mostly over. Some of the core principles of you need to get out of the building and discover some things, and I'll explain what those things are. But boy, the world is changed, and if you haven't been paying attention, you've probably been under a rock. Lean, which lasted 25 years in its current, incarnation, is about to undergo radical transformation, along with the nature of how we're building not only software, but how we're building hardware, life sciences, everything. And the methodology that, was just a framework to figure out what you should be doing and when, and how to be efficient with your time and money. That's also going to have to change. And if I can, I'll just describe some of the things I've observed, which I'm sure a good number of your audience are observing or actually doing right now. But
please,
part of the reason of lean, the part I contributed to, was customer discovery and customer development, of get out of the building and discover whether your hypotheses were correct, and use agile engineering to build minimum viable products and search for product market fit and pivot. And if you discover things that didn't match your initial hypotheses, that is, we were no longer going to slave ourselves to a business plan, which I used to describe as the best example of creative writing you'll do, even outside of an English department, and use the business model canvas to kind of just track your hypotheses as you went along. And now if we go take a look at what's changed, what the users are doing and what the product is changed. So this notion of what I called product market fit, I'm not sure is accurate anymore. And the example I use is, my last company was an enterprise software company. And in an enterprise software, you're building tools and products and features for users in an enterprise to do some kind of business thing, business process thing, et cetera. So just imagine it was a tool for somebody in supply chain, and you would give them a product where they'd have a dashboard and a screen that maybe connected different silos in the company and whatever. And you could just imagine their daily work was with the screen, clicking on things, looking at stuff, analyzing what they should do. And gee, is inventory low? Should I order some stuff? Oh, let me now click the button and I could send out a solicitation. Gee, look at that. I can now send it out automatically by clicking this stuff and analyzing. And gee, now I got these bids back, and now I got to look at all the bids. And well, that was a human being, and you were building features for a product to see if it matched what their needs were, and you had to go out and identify what their needs are. I'll contend today that the final product doesn't involve a human being at all, or not very much. Final product is not going to be a screen. It's going to be a set of agents, and the user interface might be a command line that says, like manage and order an inventory and let me know when it's there. And so now all of a sudden it's not the search for product market fit. It's the search for agent outcome fit. That's a big idea. And it's not like, gee, these agents magically appear. You have to build those and you have to understand those. So what I said about it depends, customer discovery is still there. You now need to understand the business process and what kind of guardrails do you want to put, behind the agents. You don't want to end up we ordered 10 trillion paper clips, and, the world's resources are now behind the building paper clips. So you do need to do discovery, but the whole notion of what the role of the human being is and what product market fit is kind of goes away. The other thing that radically changed, and I see it in my classes now at Stanford with my students, is that the minimum viable product used to be both an artifact you could show customers of both your progress. You could show it to VCs. It was kind of like, how real are you, et cetera. I mean, where before the mantra was, no one on the internet knows your dog. Now the mantra is that, like, your cat can develop an MVP in an hour. It's like you could spin up almost anything now, and if it's taking you more than a day, you probably went to the movies and like slept in, because the tools out there are just absolutely incredible. It doesn't mean that's your finished product, but the MVP is no longer a test, to investors about your team's competence. And number two, it allows you to put in front of customers, an infinite variety of MVPs. Implicit in this, and sorry, I'm giving you the course lecture. Is this okay to keep going?
Of course.
Implicit in this is what it does to the tool stack, but the number of people you need in engineering and the quality and type of people you're hiring. And so that's dramatically changed. It used to be engineering was a serial process with a set of skills, and you went through this entire stack of, DevSecOps and et cetera, and it required skilled people, all of them from top to bottom. That's no longer true. You still require some skilled people with some taste about, geez, do we need any guardrails about AI safety? And, what's this code going to do in the corner cases? And is it really going to over-order inventory or, accept any price for, the orders we put in, et cetera? So you do need people who understand how to write agents, or at least, how to prompt agents and how to put the right guardrails in and connect all these functions, because you're going to have literally a good app will have multiple agents running in parallel, running around and coordinating with the framework. I mean, OpenClaw just, leveled us up to a place that was just unimaginable 2 months ago or 3 months ago. So that's a different skill set than someone, you would have hired 6 months ago. And so the consequences we could talk about are just pretty insane. That just didn't exist a year. I mean, we saw it coming a year ago, but the release of Claude, the code, the releases of OpenClaw, the continual iteration of large language models don't look like they're slowing down. They're getting harder to build, but they're certainly going to continue at this scale. What was your question?
Well, just to play devil's advocate a bit. So something we've talked about for years and other people are talking about more now is that the rate limiting factor for a lot of scaling tech companies has been developers. And that's changing significantly. But I would argue the rate limiting factor for successful 0 to 1 or 0 to 5 startups is mindset and is true customer discovery and creativity and vision and walking that path. Do you think that that's changed, Steve?
Well, I think the definition of success has changed, and then we could discover about the type of entrepreneur. So, way back in the Stone Age, when I was an entrepreneur, success meant an IPO, that is an initial public offering, a stock market, because that was the only time you or your investors would make money. I mean, that's laughable now. It's like, but we would all eat ramen and take incredibly low salaries and worry about burn rate, and that is how much money you were spending each month. I'm not suggesting that's gone away for every entrepreneur, but it's certainly gone away for the top 10% who are in AI. That's no longer the game. And so what's happened now is, at least again, I'm not talking about every entrepreneur in the world, but at least the top frothy at top, is that the ability or the need to create a product that generates substantive revenue and the ability to make a pile of money are completely disconnected, just completely disconnected. That is, you could raise $100 million, never ship a product, or never generate, more than a couple $1 million of revenue.
Take a secondary at the seed round.
Yeah, and get insanely rich. I'm not suggesting that's the path, but I'm suggesting that's a path that was no longer available, is completely irrational, is the indication of a bubble, but this bubble has been going on for a while because AI truly is disruptive and transformative. It's like the internet bubble I lived in and retired in, in the turn of the century. The only claim I'll make is we actually had $100 and some odd million of revenue in our third year. It wasn't just froth, but the valuations were equally insane. But now they're off by 3 orders of magnitude from what the internet bubble was. So to answer your question, yes, a founder, being a founder isn't a job. It's the world's worst job. It's the world's best calling. Many times I get students asking us, Professor Plank, I'm trying to figure out which job I should take. And I can't tell you, almost every year I got the same kind of question and with the same kind of results is, well, what's your choices? Oh, I got this great offer from McKinsey. Well, McKinsey, great company, or at least it was then. Well, what's your other choice? Oh, me and my friends are thinking of a startup. And I'd say, you already decided. Like, well, no, I want to talk about, I said, listen, McKinsey is a job. It's a great job, but a startup is a terrible job. But if you're not called to this, if you don't wake up in the morning thinking, you want to work all day and sleep under your desk and, and you just can't wait to build something and show it to people and you're excited about the product and you're passionate about the change it's going to make and you're not chasing the money, but you're chasing the vision. That's what a founder is. A founder, to me, and I've been saying this for a while, I'm not sure people have really thought about this deeply, but a founder is closer to an artist than any other profession. Founders aren't accountants, with all due respect to, or maybe not to accountants. Accounting is a job. But artist isn't a job. You can't split a room in half and say half of you are going to be accountants and half are going to be artists. It's something that comes from inside. It's a passion-driven thing. Artists see things that other people don't. So do founders. Artists hear things that other people don't. So do founders. Artists have this passion to create, and more importantly, they have a personality that realizes, or maybe doesn't realize, but it happens. Most art fails. Right? Most songs are, terrible. Most plays never get produced. Most novels go in the garbage. And most paintings, etc. But they're resilient. They get off there, get depressed. They drink a lot or smoke a lot of dope or do whatever. But then they get off the floor and do it again and again. That's the nature to me, of a true founder. And let me exhale and say, that's changed now, and that those founders still exist. But it is possible to just be, completely in it for the money, because the money is there at an absurd scale. And you can say that, well, Steve, that's nice. Glad you guys exist. But let me tell you how I'm going to ride this AI hype train and just spin this thing up and, raise $100 million and then take 10 million off the top before, the next round and go home. And I'm 22. Okay.
So Steve, I loved your latest blog post. The title is "Your Startup is Probably Dead on Arrival." It's provocative. It's a good one. So we just discussed, right? AI is rapidly commoditizing tech stacks. It's changing the dynamic of company building. What is the most common misstep you see founders making at inception on arrival?
Well, the dead on arrival part is, whatever assumptions you had when you started your company, it's time to, step back, go out, take a walk around the building and see if those things are still true. I mean, literally, unless you're constantly, watching the tool stack and the funding environment, et cetera, whatever you believed more than a year ago is just simply wrong. Not because you were dumb or whatever, but the environment is changing so rapidly. You really need to take it into account. Look around and look at your engineers, whether these still the people you need. The surprising one is, of course, I think most people in software, it would take about an hour worth of consideration you could think about. Oh, we miss, boy, if you miss Claude, you really should be rethinking about your company or the equivalent. But for hardware, and I get, well, Steve, that works for software. I'm building this piece of silicon or building a piece of hardware. What does that have to do with me? Well, it has everything to do with you. Is now, if you're not building a digital twin, you're missing the whole part about customer discovery. You shouldn't be waiting a year to put something in a customer's hands. You should be giving them digital twins. That is, think about, we used to do simulations in the past, but a digital twin is, think of it as a simulation on steroids that you can now share with a customer, and they could be playing with that twin and giving you feedback constantly while you're trying to build the product. And they could go, well, we really aren't using these kind of top 3 features, but number 4, 9, and 12 is what we pay for. And if you're instrumenting that, you could actually see that in real time. Oh, they're actually, and again, it doesn't have to be a digital twin of an entire product. It could be part of a manufacturing process, or it could be, part of the key circuit, or it could be part of something else. And you would have thought, well, okay, I can imagine that maybe in hardware, but it's not going to work in life science. AlphaFold won the Nobel Prize for, essentially doing 75 years of work for protein folding. And, we've figured out the configurations of 50 or 75,000 proteins in 50 or 70 years. And AlphaFold found 200 million. And most of them are correct or closer to correct than the ones we had by doing X-ray crystallography. And now we're multiple generations past, AlphaFold. We're doing complicated proteins and protein membrane interactions and whole genome, predictions and whatever. So AI has affected every field, not just software or hardware, but everything. Well, whoever thought life sciences? And what's interesting is, of course, is what we call the tech world, hardware and software, lives in a completely parallel universe than life sciences. If you're in life sciences, Claude, blah, 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 but let me tell you about my tool set. And if you're in software, blah, 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 I know nothing about the next generation of life science tools. So I just think, answer a question, I think people need to take a long pause if they started their company probably before June 2025, take stock of what's around them, and do that inventory of technology stack, people needed, funding available. I'm sure it's obvious, but if you're not in AI, the available pool of VC money, if you want to be venture funded, has gotten smaller, not bigger. Well, why? I hear about all these billion-dollar deals. Guess what? They're not going into your area. They're all being that giant sucking sound. Is all that money going into AI? And rightly so, because VCs are nothing more than a financial asset class, with, maybe better offices or maybe not, and that actually go where the money is. And the money for the returns are all going into AI, bubble valuations. So why would I be funding anything else, even though it might be a great product and maybe in other times you might have been, on the top of the pile. If you don't have AI in your pitch, you're probably, not going to get a meeting, or the meeting's going to get a lot harder. Of course, there are contrarian VCs, et cetera. But again, VCs are driven by where are they going to get the most return? It's just pretty simple math.
So as we look at the founders that are building, one of the concerns I have is related to the abundance and the speed and the amount that one can do and do so much faster.
Creates slop, right? It's this
right.
AI
it creates a lot of slop, right? Because more isn't always better. Better is better. Brad Feld was on the show and shared that quote. So my question for you is, what should founders stop doing immediately if they want to survive the shift and thrive amongst this AI shift?
What founders need to stop doing immediately is thinking that whatever they had in their heads prior to this year is true, that now we're back to customer discovery. It's literally like you've just been transported to the 22nd century. I think these tools are kind of like a time tunnel warp that we got, 22nd century tools transported right in the middle of our, workday. And so we need to just get out and actually start testing not only our assumptions, which I talked about, but we now need to test potential customer assumptions. Whether you're selling to a consumer, okay, what's the platform? Probably some kind of phone or something else, or some kind of consumer device. So what do those platforms look like? Well, some of them have changed, but not that radically. And then in the enterprise, this is the Alan Kay quote, "The future's here, but it's not evenly distributed." There are some CIOs and, some organizations that are right there, AI native upfront with you, and they're willing to adopt at scale. There are others who are, there's some probably using client server somewhere in the basement. I mean, the fact that the Artemis astronauts were using Outlook, I don't know if you read that. They had to call tech support from, a couple 100,000 miles away from Earth because they were stuck because Outlook was spinning up 2 instances and they needed to call NASA tech support. If I was Apple, I would have said, or SpaceX, I said, we're sending a rocket with a Mac, to catch you up. It's like, what? If there was ever an example that, the future's here, but not evenly distributed, it's on the way to the moon. So you could actually see the future, but now all of a sudden you might be creating a new market where you're ahead of your customers. So you need to understand adoption stuff. So this all talks about customer discovery, because you could be excited about the tools and what agents could look at this and whatever. And your potential customers are just freaking out about security and guardrails and AI safety, and won't even let this thing inside the building. So that would be the other thing I would be thinking about is, while you're so excited about what you could do and the demos are great, depending on who and where you're selling to, adoption might be a lot harder than you think. Some will be a lot easier.
Talk more about that, like the customer profile and we just went through this SaaS apocalypse, right? $2 trillion in value has been erased. Some say it's an overcorrection. Some say it's warranted. But talk more about, what solutions will be built internally. Customers are going to do the make versus buy decision. And what types of products have true defensibility versus not in kind of the new world.
This is way before most of your listeners and viewers were around, but I was reminded when the Mac first came out, we take for granted, multiple type fonts and bitmap screens, etc. But it was a shock to the system. And in fact, it allowed everybody to say, well, what do I need a graphic artist for? What do I need to these professional people who are making slides and newsletters? And I could do all that myself. And the answer was pretty true for some real basic stuff. You can now make your own newsletter and whatever. And for when PowerPoint came out, oh my gosh, graphics houses went out of business and you were creating your own PowerPoint slides. They were the ugliest things you've ever seen. And in fact, some of them looked like ransom notes. And I remember actually I made one of them where you could use a font to every other word. And you don't see those anymore. But trust me, there's a whole set of that literature out there that we call the ransom note literature. So the quality actually went down. Seriously, the quality for the first 2 or 3 years went down until actually professionals just started using those tools and the companies started giving templates and whatever. And so we went through a world where quality went down, but the number of people who could create these things scaled unbelievably exponentially.
That's
it was
classic disruption, right?
Classic disruption. It was just like, when we had bespoke weavers in England, and then we set up looms, with whatever. The quality of the cloth went down, probably 10x. Was no longer, 300 count, whatever. But now millions of people had access to incredibly cheap cloth. And those weavers didn't go away. Some small fractions still end up today as craftspeople, but the masses now have access to this stuff. I think so to answer your question, this is what happens in disruption. We're going to see every company experimenting with tools. It's already, I see that. And if it's not like a core part of IT, it's now hidden in the basement or attic. There are people playing, hey, look what I could do and whatever. And by the way, I'm sure one of these will go wild and be worse than a cyber attack. It'll, erase your, customer accounts or do something or put out these orders because it was an agent and it wasn't just one and they start talking to each other. I mean, I'm sure we're not going to shut down the entire power system by accident. Could happen. But we are going to see this era of experimentation. And the good news is, I think that will be the, another harbinger of a disruptive transformation era, is that you will see every company asking, the SaaS apocalypse, I'm sure your readers know, it was just finance, investors saying, well, wait a minute, if I could spin up a version of Salesforce, or at least the core features I need within a week or two, is that good enough? And what's that going to do to every enterprise software company? The reality, and this is back to your point, there are moats, that is, it's not every SaaS company is going to go out of business, but every one of them, I'm sure, are asking the same question. Mm-hmm. Are our moats in distribution? Are our moats in regulatory things? That is, did we have to get licenses in every state for a banking app? Can you spin up a banking app? Oh, I'm done. Okay, well, can you spin up approval in states? Well, that's still another year or two, right? Or, gee, I'm gonna do medical diagnostics for radiology. Great. Do you have the corpus? Do you have the database of 5 million other radiographs to X-rays to kind of train the large language model? So data is still proprietary access to data, though the problem is large language models are ingesting a ton of what used to be proprietary data, so the bar of what's proprietary is going up. But regulatory things, access to distribution, I mean, you could make a small but important list, but that list is no longer, dependent on, I have access to the world's best programmers. Yeah,
that's right.
You will have access to different types of programmers, and I'm not sure we've articulated yet about what's the software mix, software developer mix you need, but it ain't those masses of developers that were highly valued. Whoever thought the first people who'd be worrying about their jobs as software developers? I mean, it never occurred to me. It was like, oh no, all those other folks. It's going to be those low-level clerks. No, it's actually the people who write code.
I was in Menlo a few weeks ago, and somebody was telling me that the top 2 graduates from Stanford CF got paid over $1 million by the biggest tech companies, and the rest of the class is struggling to find jobs.
Yeah, and by the way, they're wrong. It wasn't over $1 million. There was another digit involved. Seriously, I've had students. Okay. Yeah, and I've had students tell me, when the Meta and OpenAI bidding war, I mean, they were getting offers for more money than I made like for a good part of my career. Unbelievable. But you're right. If you're a commodity, and let's leave the top 10 universities out of that. If you're just in CS and some other university, you're going to have a very different career. And where you might have thought you were in the pinnacle of your career, it's kind of like when doctors became commoditized. It's not like, when doctors had to work in now groups and practices, and those practices are now being, bought up by private equity. You're no longer this independent individual who was it was the top profession that, like in the 1950s and 60s, to be a doctor, you made more money than anybody else, et cetera. It's now you still have to go through that same arduous training. They didn't shorten the course, but it's not like your knowledge has gotten any smaller. You now need to know it like probably 10 or 50x more, but it's now been a commoditized business. It's gone from that weavers in the room to now kind of an industrial scale craft or industrial scale business. Software and development has just undergone that. And again, it's not happening in every room exactly the same way, but that'll even out. And that's what happens in disruption. And it's not everywhere, every same place, same time. But within a couple of years, it does level out to now we're playing over here. The one that blew me away, Nick, is I have some friends. One of them runs the CTO office in the UK, in the foreign office. And I saw him like 3 months ago in March, and we were talking about, how they're going to implement AI and blah, 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 and nice, great theoretical thing. And I went, well, it's London, maybe at the turn of this decade. I just got back there and just saw them in June. And it blew my mind what they already had developed. I mean, literally in 3 months. And I'm going, and this is London, that's Silicon Valley, and shame on me for, thinking like, people aren't dumber anywhere. We just have more access to capital here. But the fact that the diffusion of this innovation was immediate and obvious to anybody in a technical cluster, or even if, you had 4 of you in a room, you probably figured it out in Mongolia, that the world that we knew was over. So just watching this in practice in a place that I wouldn't have thought was a bleeding edge. And in fact, it's probably worth mentioning, great, they had some great tech. And they thought, just like any great tech group, okay, everybody's going to adopt it. And here's the other barrier, is that I went, well, do you understand how you're going to get this, tens of thousands of people in an organization that's been around since the 1600s going to adopt disruptive technology? Oh, and then we had to talk about saboteurs, and we had to talk about the diffusion of innovation, and we had to talk about how these things get budgeted, and what are they going to turn off, and what are they going to keep, and whatever. That had nothing to do with the tech. It had to do with deployment. And deployment is, as people will tell you in every disruptive phase, is completely uneven. When we built our last company, it's kind of, you can giggle about it now, is we were fighting against client server, and people were happy to keep doing that. And we were going, no. There's this thing called the browser. You could access your data from everywhere. And by the way, we were building these data warehouses that'll suck in data from multiple sources. And no, Steve, it's, we've been using this for, well, that was not a technology problem. That was an adoption problem. Does that make sense?
It does, 100%. Yeah, I mean, the way that things are evolving so rapidly, I kind of wanted your input too on fundraising. So I sent around one of our Series B startups the other day. It 3x'd in 24. It 4x'd in 25. It's doing significant revenue. And the response I got from a very famous name in the Valley is, we look for more explosive growth at this scale.
Yeah.
I kind of had a chuckle, but the classic T2, D3, triple twice, double 3 times growth benchmark seems to no longer be the gold standard, right? Folks are looking for just tremendous, rapid scale. And you and I have discussed the founder in their reality distortion field. Like, is the venture industry in a distortion field right now, or is this kind of what we should expect persistently in the future?
Listen, I actually did one of these in a much earlier bubble. We went from 3 to 12 to 120 million bucks, 3 years. And that curve would have continued, but then the bubble crashed, right? And then, the company got sold. It still got sold for, whatever, but we went public at the 120, and back then an $8 billion market cap was a lot of money. But there was a revenue curve that was that hockey stick of explosive growth. That's what investors and the founders should be thinking about. When I say get out of the building and look about what's changed, you're expecting from investors that you want to be on that stick. It's not that the other companies are dumb or wrong or whatever, but they're no longer on the curve that I need to take advantage of as an investor. I remind people that the good news is, when you're in an innovation cluster, it's not just the bright entrepreneurs, on one hand, it's the crazy people with capital at the other. And without one, you just have one hand clapping. And so there's still only 10 to 20 places in the world where you could raise $100 million. But you got to understand the impedance match between what their business model is and yours. And so I remind people, when you're raising money, the minute you take money from someone, their business model becomes yours. What that means is you need to understand what's their model nowadays. Well,
that's right.
Again, 3 years ago, they would have said, hey, $100 million valuation, that's really good. Now they're going, no, stand in line with the small business guys over here, because I'm investing in things that have billions. Or what's the SpaceX IPO going to go out at? $1 trillion or $2 trillion? I mean, come on. We're talking about now all of a sudden, think about it.
We used to talk about unicorns on this show 10 years ago.
Right.
Now it's $1 trillion private companies.
One of my friends is a VC who owns a piece of Anthropic, right? Think about that. That firm is valued at what, $380 billion, and OpenAI, $800 billion or whatever the numbers are. I mean, wherever we're talking about things that are greater than the gross national product of like some countries. So assume you own 10% of that as a VC. We're talking about $80 billion that are returned in a fund. And now you're asking me as a founder, not like, tell me your thing is going to be worth 100 million. Tell me your thing is going to be worth $1 billion. And you're happy that you could generate, $10 million a year next year. That's what I call this impedance mismatch. So part of getting out of your building that I said, it's looking at new circumstances, is looking, what are the VCs looking for? And it's nothing about you. It's about where they're putting their money. That was my point. If you're not doing AI at that scale, your potential funding pool has gotten smaller, not larger, because now you need to find the VCs who say, no, these valuations are insane. We're not going to chase these things. We're going to go after different returns, and we're going to find the groups that are making real money. Those people exist, but you need to make sure you're not looking in the wrong place at the standard names. If your VC is invested in any of the large language model companies, they're probably not investing in you. That should probably be the heuristic.
Product market fit, but equity market fit, right? It's a different cast of characters for different types of businesses.
And that's always existed. I mean, I used to have students who go, well, I'm building this great small business. I'm going to make, I'm going to drop $2 million a year into my bank account. I went, great. Well, what's the problem? Oh, I can't get Sequoia or back then Kleiner or somebody to pay attention. Well, no wonder why they're not interested in like, you've built a great small business, but that's not venture fundable, at least at the scale of the people you're talking to. So understanding who you are, I used to build this taxonomy of lifestyle businesses, small businesses, venture scale businesses, entrepreneurs, NGOs, et cetera. There's now another, I'd probably add to that taxonomy is, AI, hyperscale businesses, just like hyperscalers, hyperscale businesses that, again, it's just matching, your interest in theirs about what return you can have. And again, some of these businesses that people could start, you might now go back to some of the first principles of being a founder is, can I generate enough cash by myself? AI allows us to do some of those things that I don't need.
Many of them don't need the funding. They don't require them.
And so we've gotten so accustomed to having conversations on talks like this, to talking about, venture capital and whatever, to like, let's say, well, basic principles, maybe a loan for mom and dad. How quickly can you bootstrap this thing, and how far? And can you get it to a point where somebody might actually say this is worth playing with? Because again, if we believe in the principles that we just said, that this is disruptive in terms of number of people with headcount and whatever, that article, I don't know if it was in Wall Street Journal or Times, that said 2 kids just spun up a $1 billion market cap business of $400 million compounding GLP drugs. First of all, I thought it was BS, but two is it does capture the sense of what's possible. That might not have been possible a year or two ago. That is, we're back to full circle. And in the 50s and 60s, most startups were bootstrapped. Because there was no venture capital as an industry.
So, Steve, I want to switch gears, but while I have you, I want to talk defense. And we don't have a ton of time, and it's a big topic. But just to start, can you help frame the historical context on defense, in sort of how the U.S. achieved its dominance, and kind of what's required so that we don't lose it?
Yeah. So for anybody interested, a couple of years ago, I asked that same question. It's like, wait a minute, we're all building consumer stuff, and Apple and Intel and whatever back then in Silicon Valley. But I keep hearing this background. I started in my career in the military, and my first company was kind of a halfway house between a military career and startup. So just FYI, everything I'm going to say, I put in a presentation called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. People go to my website, steveblank.com. There's a tab called Secret History, and a video and more links than you'll ever want. But basically, Silicon Valley was not started by entrepreneurs building consumer devices. It was started by a Stanford professor who ran electronic warfare and electronic intelligence in World War II for the U.S. government. Set up a massive 800-person lab. They moved them to Harvard to do it, called the Harvard Radio Research Lab, which had nothing to do with Harvard radio or research. And then when the war ended, he took his best engineers and managers back to Stanford and set up a microwaves and physics and electronics warfare department, because every university during the Cold War with the Soviet Union was working on weapon systems, not just teaching students, how to read Chaucer. And Stanford became a center of excellence for U.S. Department of Defense, and then our intelligence agencies who were also interested in some of these problems. The Vietnam War happened, and all classified work got moved off of campus, which by accident started a whole new wave of defense startups. And so Silicon Valley is always historically supported defense. So is MIT around Boston and Johns Hopkins and University of Michigan and blah, blah, blah. Always had a defense component from the Cold War, which never went away. But what happened about 5 or 6 years ago is a couple of brave venture capitalists said, I think there's a business here. At the same time, we at Stanford saw the same thing and stood up with something called the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation, which basically said that commercial technology was going to have a major impact on the Department of Defense. They just don't know it yet. And I got the head of the Office of Naval Research back then, Admiral Selby, to see the same thing, which it was pretty prescient, that the DOD department, then the Department of Defense, needed to really tap into what was going on back then. We called it AI, machine learning, autonomy, access to space, biotech, all these things that we now take for granted that are coming from startups in the Department of Defense. But it wasn't obvious then. We started a class called Hacking for Defense, which is now in 63 U.S. universities, 17 in the UK, just spun up one in Germany and Poland, where students could work on national security problems. And now, another alternative for anybody listening is that there's an enormous amount of money going into defense startups from VCs that never existed before.
Yeah.
Shield Capital, DC
$20 billion annually.
Yeah,
more
than 20. I mean, just, the floodgates have opened. Why? Because disruption, you think it's happening in software? I mean, look at the war in Iran.
What happens to the primes, do you think?
So the primes, just for your listeners, are the top 5 or 10 defense contractors, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, what used to be called Raytheon, et cetera.
Northrop.
Some names that may or may not be familiar. They historically built the, aircraft carrier, Huntington Ingalls, who built the aircraft carriers, General Dynamics, who builds the Virginia-class attack submarines. They were the ones who built these Battlestar Galacticas. I mean, these giant, things that required, thousands of people. It's exactly like, giant software engineering, pre-Claude. All of a sudden, we could argue that whether we do or still
well,
should
even
be
Artemis, right?
Yeah.
It was Boeing, I think.
Right. Boeing SLS, the biggest, probably boondoggle next to the Lockheed's F-35. So, I mean, these were exquisite systems, and when they worked incredibly well. But in the meantime, adversaries were building non-exquisite systems, like drones that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars that you didn't need to sink an aircraft carrier. All you needed to do is make the flight deck inoperable by, peppering the flight deck or destroying the catapults. And now all of a sudden you have the world's worst floating hotel rather than a floating, airbase. Or as we're seeing, gee, I got all these great aircraft parked on the next to the runway, but now all of a sudden I could have drones flying right into the revetments, or some of them are even parked without any aircraft shelters. Go figure. So the whole notion of asymmetric weapons, literally, it's not like no one talked about it, but no one was investing in it at scale. The war in Ukraine kind of like, people are now shooting 1 million drones a year at each other, maybe more. And so we've just decided to scale up drones and autonomy and all this other stuff. But to answer your question, historically, primes, just like large organizations, were not designed to kind of build small, cheap things. Their whole overhead cost and everything was designed to bid on and work with the world's most complicated acquisition system. I remind my students, if you know anything about selling to the enterprise, you'll put yourself out of business in about an hour trying to use those same that same wording in the Department of War. It looks nothing like that. People who control the budget are in a separate organization that's in Congress. The people who write the requirements are over here. The people who actually buy are over here. The people who deploy are over here. And the other major shift that happened 2 years ago in this administration is they basically brought in people who took all 70 years of, or now 80 years of paperwork process that got in our way and literally took it out to the back and shot it in its head. I mean, it's essentially private equity has acquired the Department of War acquisition system.
Which is a good thing or no?
Awesome thing. I mean, if you believe that we ought to have an efficient Defense Department and ought to try to keep pace with technology and whatever, the head of Cerebras, Feinberg, is now the number 2 in the Department of Defense. So while you have the ideological warriors as the head of the Department of Defense and Hexit, the person actually doing the work internally and reorganizing is the private equity guy. And they essentially did a private equity roll-up of they took all these silos and said, okay, we're going to put them together. They're getting rid of tons of paperwork that says, no,
streamline
the paperwork
all of that.
In fact, the paperwork over 80 years became the product. And now he's back to, no, the product is the product, not the paperwork. So why don't we get rid of as much of this as we can? The problem for primes, to answer your question, is they became the masters of the paperwork. And that was almost an insurmountable barrier for a startup. Is who do I call on? Gee, I don't have 100 people
they understood
to fill out
the bureaucracy
4,000.
and
Yeah. So primes aren't going to go away. They're going to do 3 or 4 things. And I'm seeing some of them do all of them simultaneously. One is they're probably going to say, well, maybe we could wait out this administration and then things will be good again. Some will do that. 2 is, and all of these are doing this next one, we'll hire more lobbyists on K Street, which is where the lobbyists sit in Washington, D.C., and we'll try to change some of these rules. 3 is we'll try to start acquiring some of these startups so we can get some of their DNA. We'll do either acqui-hires or whatever. Or 4 is we'll change our business model. We're seeing some doing that. Probably the best one is, and I teach with him, so I'm biased, or we'll set up our own VC firm that could compete and start acquiring. So Lockheed now has given $1 billion to their head of VC, Chris Moran, who's probably the best corporate VC I know of anywhere, defense or not. And I say that because he's my co-instructor at Hacking for Defense, but he's also, if you look at his portfolio, it's very thoughtful, aligns with Lockheed's mission and also aligns with what national security needs. So there's a whole nother, remember I said this parallel world of life science startups don't know about tech startups. Yeah. There's another parallel world going on about defense startups. And if you're in autonomy or AI or whatever, that's an opportunity.
Does that kind of impact your viewpoint on dual use pitch startups, like trying to do this in serial, selling to commercial as well as government?
So when this was a new market, meaning, these defense VCs were kind of new and whatever, people said, well, you should probably do commercial and defense. And maybe you could, earn your chops in like commercial and then you could take it to defense or maybe vice versa.
It's all easy, Steve, all this stuff.
You don't hear that much anymore because the defense money is here. Take this basket of money now. If you could deliver 1,000 drones or autonomous surface or underwater vehicles. Now the good news is or bad news, that's also a bubble. You can't have 500 drone companies. I mean, you can, we do, but only 495 are going to go out of business in the next 5 or 10 years or get acquired. Because even the DOW can't acquire 500 of them. They may acquire 5. And so the moats there will be, again, your speed of delivery. There it's going to be speed of actually, the MVPs are great, but I want to know, can you deploy at scale? That's what we teach our students is not only figuring out, in the Defense Department, instead of product market fit, we teach mission solution fit. Do you understand mission and you have a solution, but can you build and deploy at scale? Well, understanding how to do that, how to get, how do you get the money? How do you get something called an OTA, other transaction authority, or, maybe potentially a program of record, and what's the path to do that? And so to help my students there, they used to ask, well, where's the phone book of who I should call in the Department now it's called Department of War. And I realized there was no phone book. And it took me a decade to realize, well, no one's going to write one, so I should write one. And so there's now a 400-page phone book with a 40-page go-to-market strategy with diagrams of how do you do this, who do you call on, et cetera. That's free, and it's on my website, and you should go get it if you're interested in this as a market. Did I answer a question about defense? I mean,
It was great.
It's
It was
another
great,
parallel universe that didn't exist. Talk about getting out of the building and getting your head aligned. It's
Yes.
another huge opportunity of if you were building, like, in fact, the whole blog post about your startup's dead on arrival came from a dinner I had with somebody who was building autonomous. Well, first he was building helicopters for autonomous firefighting, and then became autonomous software for firefighting, which again, in an existing market, lots of players, whatever. And at dinner, I realized he knew nothing about this market that like emerged since he started his company. It wasn't dumb, and it wasn't that his software wasn't useful, but gee, there are people, it's kind of mind blowing that now in Ukraine, people are talking about autonomous robots. They're using autonomy all the time for supply. So you will see supply chains of robots trundling with ammunition. You'll see autonomous. So that's called for contested logistics, meaning you're being shot at, et cetera. Why put a human being on that? You put a little robot. Doesn't even look like a truck anymore. It looks like a little delivery vehicle. At the same time, for medical evacuation. The worst thing that happens is you send 10 people to evacuate one, and now you got 10 casualties. Well, what if I could have robots doing that? And so we're already seeing that, not just trialed, but used at scale. That didn't exist 18 months ago. And so anyway, my analogy at this dinner to this founder was, you need to take a breath. Just get your head out of what you were doing, not because there's still enormous value of what you built, but you need to potentially pivot, or at least understand that there's an adjacent market that doesn't have like existing incumbents who are sitting there in meetings like this, et cetera, who might be grabbing this thing out of your hand.
Steve, if we could feature anyone here on the show, who do you think we should interview, and what would you like to hear them speak about?
Well, I think the world is undergoing multiple disruptions, right? We're in the middle of a war. We're fighting the first land war in Europe in 80 years. Technology in both commercial world and military is changing overnight. I don't know, to be honest. I'd be thinking about someone with perspective and maybe people who actually have a much clearer view of what the future looks like than I do. And Nick, I guess I'm going to pass on that, because if I knew who it was, I'd be talking to them. But I would be getting out of the, here's what's going on today, to more, what does it look like in all these areas? The politics are, this feels like the Gilded Age in the United States in the 1880s to 1900s. If you read, U.S. history, it was a pretty miserable time. We did ethnic cleansing, we did, pogroms, we did whatever in the U.S. It was not a pretty time. It turned out the world we live in from post-World War II to about 1990s or 2000 was actually a unique period of U.S. history that never existed before. And it looks like we're going back to some of these other eras of, and with now competitors with nuclear weapons and other things that, so the world is kind of similar, but not, and with technology disruption. So it's like a whole set of things that are coming at us at the same time. Probably now that I think about it, there's an economist whose blog I read religiously every day because the links are incredibly interesting. Tyler Cowan, C-O-W-A-N.
Sure. I haven't had him on the program, but I know of him.
Yeah, I would be interested in Tyler's view. Again, it is one of the things I read religiously every day, just because it's interesting. By the way, that's an underrated skill set of a founder. And I'm not talking about me, it's in general. You hear about, agility and tenaciousness and resilience and whatever, but you don't hear about intense curiosity about a lot of things. And so I always found is that and that's also a problem with founders because it sometimes gets you distracted and is a version of ADHD. But if you're not curious about a lot of things in a lot of areas, you'll never do that pattern recognition that says, well, wait a minute, this looks like this from this market. Maybe this is occurring here.
That's right.
By the way, lean and getting out of the building sometimes was confused with ADHD because, hey, look, we discovered this from a customer, and now let's go pivot. And which is why I tell people, well, at least when we used to do this, is you need to put a 72-hour hold on whatever you tell engineering, or else you're going to thrash the organization, because you can't just say, hey, we just discovered X, now do Y, until you have sufficient data. So getting out of the building was sometimes, without any constraints, is actually a denial of service attack on your own engineering group, which actually is a big idea. Yeah. Sorry. What?
That was good. That was good. Steve, do you have any habits or behaviors that are a secret weapon?
I read a lot, and this is back to curiosity. I'm just kind of hardwired to learn about a whole set of things. I could, defense and physics and life sciences, and to me, that's the most amazing thing about being around today in the world of the net and the world of large language models. You could learn almost anything.
Yeah.
And so that's my secret weapon is, and probably the only skill I do have is I actually am good at assimilating a lot of data and then seeing patterns in the data. I mean, that was, the whole lean thing wasn't invented. It was people were already doing this stuff. It wasn't like no one had gone out and talked to customers. It was actually realizing there was a pattern between successful founders and those that failed. And then my work and Reese's work and Osterwalder's work was just simply giving tools and language to the best practices of what we had. So we could kind of not make it a craft and make it at least, again, wasn't formulaic, but at least to put a bounding box around the largest parts of things that were important. That's what lean was about. That's all this was. And it's ironic is that it took me 3 years to wrap my head around something that I can now explain in 30 seconds. Think about
there it
that.
is. Steve Blank, the first AI agent. Well, there you have it. He is Steve Blank. Check out steveblank.com, The Secret History, my favorite tab, but there are many. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It was fun.